From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, November 22nd. The election is over. Now the hard part begins, governing. The Portland City Council is entering a new era, but the jostling for power is already underway. And down in Salem, there's new leadership, but familiar players. What happens next? We're here to guide you through it. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
And I'm Dirk Vanderhart, another politics reporter.
Alex, the new city councilors have been elected, and there are a lot of them. They're all Democrats, but there is a little diversity amongst them, both in where they fall politically on the progressive scale and in their life experiences. Remind us who will be on the Portland City Council starting this January.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think I've done the full rundown yet on air, so we'll get into it. Like you said, there are a lot, so this could take a second. Let's start with District 1. That's all Portland neighborhoods east of I-205. The three councilors for that district are Loretta Smith, a former Multnomah County Commissioner, Candace Avalos, a nonprofit director, and Jamie Dunphy, a government relations director for the American Cancer Society. And he also worked in late City Commissioner Nick Fish's office. Then there's District 2 in North and Northeast Portland. We have Alana Purtle-Guinea, a former legislative aide to former Governor Kate Brown. We have Dan Ryan, a current city commissioner, and then Samir Kanal, a city employee who oversaw the formation of the city's new police accountability board. And then District 3, which is almost all southeast neighborhoods west of I-205 and a few in the northeast. There we have former city commissioner Steve Novick, Portland public school teacher Tiffany Koyama Lane, and Angelita Maria, who works on policy for an anti-hunger nonprofit. And last, we have District 4. That's all neighborhoods in Portland's west side, plus a few southeast neighborhoods like Selwood and Westmoreland. The three councilors for that district are Eric Zimmerman, who is chief of staff for Multnomah County Commissioner Julie Brim Edwards. We have energy economist Mitch Green, and then Olivia Clark, who used to run government affairs for TriMet. That's it.
Okay, hey, that was helpful. There's some familiar names in there. Okay, well, one thing we know for certain is that they have a lot on their plates. There are serious budget issues facing the city. There's the housing crisis, the drug crisis. Oh, and that whole entirely new system of government to figure out. But for some of the new councilors, the first order of business is a familiar one for some politicians, jostling for power. Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, one of the first votes, maybe the first vote the council will make in January is on who will be council president. So that's a councilor who will be in charge of setting the council's agenda, meaning which policy ideas get to be voted on by city council and which don't. And they'll essentially be the spokesperson for the council in both public spaces and in the mayor's office. It's a new kind of role for City Hall, so there will be some unknowns about how it will work in reality, but there's a lot of potential for it to be as powerful as maybe the mayor. As far as we know, at least half of the incoming councilors want the job, and their campaign to get their fellow councilors to vote for them kicked off long before Election Day. I heard that some overly confident candidates called up potential winners in late October to whip votes. On the other hand, some council president hopefuls tell me they aren't pushing people to vote for them, that they just anticipate their fellow councilors will pick them for the position based on their qualities. I think some realize it's not the best optics for the public to immediately be fighting for a leadership position out of the gate. So most are kind of talking down the fervor behind these campaigns in public, but there definitely is a race going on behind the scenes.
Okay. So theoretically, now you've had a little time to process the election. What, if anything, do you think the outcomes say about Portland voters in 2024?
So a few things come to mind. First, Portlanders want change. They are unhappy with the status quo. They chose to elect a political outsider over 3 sitting council members to be mayor. They did keep one current council member, Dan Ryan, but the mayor's race shows a real anti-incumbent trend. This is something we saw in our primary election in May, where Portlanders voted out the incumbent district attorney. And of course, we saw this anti-incumbent movement on the national stage this election. Unlike the national elections, though, Portland saw a slight shift to the left. The council was more progressive, and voters ejected a more moderate law and order candidate for mayor. I think a lot of people want to say this shows a swing to the left, especially following that district attorney race in May, where Portlanders chose a more kind of moderate law and order leader over sitting DA Mike Schmidt. But I think the bigger takeaway is that Portland just wants new leadership, whatever that looks like, whoever that looks like. And at the same time, it's not an anti-government vote. We also elected a council with a lot of experience in government, former politicians, people who worked in those politicians' offices, and others who've sat on government boards and committees. So voters really chose people with experience to lead this new chapter of local government. They just didn't choose the folks who are currently in government.
We also saw really low voter turnout, particularly in District 1, which is East Portland. Why do you think that is?
First, a little bit of history. So these East Portland neighborhoods in District 1, they aren't used to being represented in City Hall. In Portland's history, only 2 members of City Council have lived in these neighborhoods. So that lack of representation has really led to low voter turnout compared to the rest of the city. In the last presidential election in 2020, only 55% of registered voters in that district cast votes. This election, where we had 3 councilors specifically elected to represent this area, that turnout was 56%. And according to some analysis by the Oregonian, of the District 1 residents who voted in this month's election, nearly 30% did not vote in the city council race. And political scientists and kind of community advocates in East Portland agree on why this is. They say that just by creating district representation, that doesn't act as a light switch. It doesn't mean people who have been left out of city decisions for decades are immediately going to be engaging in politics and rush to cast a vote. They really need to see the impact of representation to feel invested in the system. So that puts extra pressure on District 1 councilors to show voters in that area that their voices will be heard in City Hall in their first term. And I think seeing the voter turnout, the next election, maybe the one after that, will really reflect kind of the change there and if that's working.
Okay, well, as we have touched upon, there is a high degree of uncertainty about how this is all going to play out. There's a lot of new players. There's the new system of government, but expectations are high. People, like you said, in Portland really want to see change. So what do you think people can realistically expect from this council?
Yeah, I think you hit on a really interesting balancing act that we're going to see out the gate. These electeds are expected to keep the city running smoothly under a new form of government, but they have also made a lot of promises on the campaign trail that people are going to hold them accountable for. Some councilors say it'll be an extra layer of pressure, and they'll essentially build the plane while they're flying it. This is a metaphor I've heard way too many times about this new council. There are folks who have won their position who made pledges to improve renters' rights. They made pledges to strengthen Portland street response. They made pledges to boost the amount of police in Portland. And whether they can do that while also keeping the city running is a question mark. Others, don't see these goals working against each other. For example, Alana Purtle-Guinea, the councilor-elect I mentioned earlier, who's in District 2, she said her top campaign pledge was to ensure that the new government is starting smoothly. So it doesn't really go against her pledges on the campaign trail. She said she just really wants to zero in on that work. Here she is.
We need to be asking Portlanders for time and patience, because if we don't build this system well, we won't be able to make progress on the big issues.
So it'll be interesting to see how councilors organize their priorities out the gate. And if by rushing through certain policies and pledges, if it slows the work of getting this new government off the ground.
All right. Thank you. Dirk, let's switch to you.
Okay.
Here we are again. The election is over. The 2025 long legislative session is looming.
Oof.
And there are some new, old legislative leaders.
Yeah, I mean, one in particular, right? I think the person you are talking about is Christine Drazan. We learned Monday night Drazan has been named House Republican leader, which is really just a sort of full circle event. So Drazan, of course, was the 2022 Republican nominee for governor. She came in second in a 3-way race that featured now Governor Tina Kotek and Betsy Johnson, who wasn't affiliated with a party. But before Drazan was a gubernatorial nominee, she served in the House and actually really came into prominence during 2 years she spent there as Republican leader. Now she's won her old House seat back after losing the governor's race. And before she could even be sworn into that role, she's been named leader again.
Okay, so people who remember her last stint as leader, which is probably like 2% of Oregonians, will recall that she sort of forcefully took the job. She launched what was basically a coup against then-leader Carl Wilson. How did she come to power this time?
Yeah, it was not that. This was precipitated really when Jeff Helfrich, who had been serving as House Minority Leader, announced basically that he was fed up with the role. He felt people in his caucus were sniping at him all the time. There is often a lot of jostling, some sharp elbows in that caucus, I think. And he just sort of decided he'd rather spend time with his family than in what can be a pretty thankless job, which minority leaders certainly can be. But as far as I've been able to tell, there actually wasn't any meaningful campaign to challenge or unseat Helfrich. So when he said he wasn't running again, Republicans were sort of looking around wondering who might step up. I heard a couple names in that discussion. I heard Representative Ed Deal from SIO. He actually told me in a text message he did put his name forward. I heard Representative Lucetta Elmer. She's from McMinnville. But there was also, I think, a sense that Drazan had the experience. She'd been there before. If she wanted the job, she would probably get it. Turns out she got it.
When Drazan served as House Leader the first time, she was not afraid to use delay tactics to slow down the Democratic agenda. Her election really actually changed the tenor of the State House in 2019. What do you expect this time around?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't know exactly what to expect. I haven't been able to speak with Drazan yet about what her priorities are going to be. But you're right. She's a politician who has not been afraid to use the tools that are available to her if she feels like Democrats are not giving Republicans meaningful input. I think the question is going to be, well, a couple questions, but one big question is what tools actually exist now, right? Drazan has used walkouts before. Notably, in 2020, Republicans killed a Democratic climate change bill basically via a walkout. But that, remember, was before Measure 113, which is the law that blocks lawmakers who walk out from seeking re-election. So I think it's fair to expect a walkout will be a lot harder to muster support for if there are those kinds of big agreements in Salem next year. As you noted, Drazan has also used delay tactics like forcing Democrats to read bills in full before a vote. That's still an option, but I think Democrats also think if they schedule things right, they can probably get their most of their agenda through, even if Republicans are reading bills. Again, I don't want to assume there will be this kind of friction next year, but we also know that Republicans will be in the superminority in the Senate. Depending on what happens in House District 22, it sort of looks like they will be in a superminority in the House as well. And as I've said before, superminorities in the past have led to more drastic tactics by Republicans.
Drazan and Governor Kotek have a very interesting history. They both served in the House together. Obviously, they ran against each other for the seat in the governor's office. There is not a lot of goodwill between the two of them.
No.
How do you think their history is going to play out if or when Democrats need Republican support for the legislature to function?
Yeah, I mean, we know that when there are big standoffs in the legislature, the governor sometimes steps in to broker a deal. Kate Brown attempted to do it with cap and trade in 2019 and 2020. Last year, Governor Kotek tried to do it when the Republicans walked away from the Capitol. She actually wasn't able to achieve anything in that and sort of announced that she had stepped away and sort of quit it. I think it's fair to suspect that she would have basically zero leverage with Drazan in a situation like that. Drazan had made clear she will never trust Kotek again after Kotek backed out of a deal the two had struck in 2020 over redistricting. That is something that I think will always hang over their relationship.
There was also an unexpected change in Senate leadership. Democrat Kathleen Taylor is out as Senate Democratic leader. And this is sort of unusual because the timing is weird to switch leadership, especially when Taylor hasn't made any obvious public missteps. I mean, Democrats did well in the last election cycle. They flipped a seat. They're going to hold a 3/5 supermajority in the Senate next year. So what gives here?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, it's not a weird time to switch leadership in that the caucuses choose leaders after an election, right? That is sort of the status quo. But you're right, this is a move that people were surprised by for a number of reasons. The first is that Senate Democrats just elected Taylor leader 5 months ago. And the second is that you are right. The Democrats had a good election this year in the Senate. They flipped a Bend Senate district that had long been held by Republicans. They successfully defended a really hard-fought seat in Gresham. And normally when something like that happens, a caucus leader like Taylor is considered pretty safe. But as we know, that didn't happen. Instead, Democrats met over the weekend and wound up choosing Casey Jama from Portland as Senate Majority Leader. This actually sounds like it was quite an affair, really. These caucus votes are really kept confidential. People don't like to talk about what happened behind closed doors. But what I have heard from a number of people is that Senator Winsve Campos actually challenged Taylor. The two women were deadlocked in a vote, and eventually Jama came out as the compromise candidate. And I think the answer to why, right, Taylor ultimately lost after just 5 months lies partly in some rocky relationships she had with other Democrats previously that were just never repaired as leader. And that combined with some staffing moves that actually, it seems, angered some people in her caucus. She let go of a couple policy staffers. She tried to let go of a communication staffer that had worked with all Senate Democrats to sort of get their messages out. And that really seemed to fire people up, increase some sort of momentum to challenging her. The question for me is, does any lasting damage come from this? It seems like there are some raw feelings in this caucus right now. How are they able to work through it in time for January?
Yeah. Okay, last question on leadership in the Senate. The Republicans in the Senate are going to be led by Daniel Bonham. He's from the Dalles, and he's really good friends with Drazan. He also has been clear that he doesn't really trust the governor. What do you expect from his leadership? And I'm just going to ask the question that everyone always asks, which is, are there going to be more walkouts?
Yes. I mean, as I said, I think walkouts are going to be a harder sell, maybe a very hard sell after Measure 113. And the fact that we know that the Supreme Court has enforced it and people have lost their ability to run again. In the Senate, every Republican except one would have to agree to essentially torpedo their legislative futures in order to do a successful walkout. That probably won't be hard for the senators, who already can't run because they've walked out last time. But 2 sitting senators in 2023 declined to walk last time. If they declined again, that would right away take it off the table. And there are new faces that probably aren't that keen on doing it. As always, it really depends on what kinds of fights are being had, what sorts of bills Democrats want to pass. But in terms of Drazan and Bonham, there's no doubt they are close. I mentioned that Drazan launched a coup. Actually, you mentioned Drazan launched a coup over the House Republican office in 2019. And Daniel Bonham actually helped in that effort. He was sort of her lieutenant in that. They have remained close, and I think we probably expect there will be a good amount of communication between House and Senate Republicans next year. And we should also note that Bonham is already showing signs that Republicans will have a sort of defiant stance in the session. Not that surprising given they will be in the superminority, but, he sent a letter out this week sort of tearing into Senate President Rob Wagner, who he says had been sort of glossing over the major conflicts between the two parties in 2023 and presenting a more rosy picture of things. To be frank, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that letter, but it doesn't necessarily suggest things are going to go super smooth.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap this podcast up here pretty soon. But before we go, one last question for each of you. Alex, looking ahead, how do you think this new city council is going to work with the city's new mayor, Keith Wilson?
Yeah, that's a big unknown. First, it's worth noting how the mayor's role is changing under this new form of government. Incoming mayor Keith Wilson, a trucking CEO and political newcomer, he'll be holding a more administrative role than the previous Portland mayors. He'll be responsible for carrying out the policies that city council essentially votes on and proposes. There's a real possibility that the city government could unravel a little if they disagree on policy decisions and enter a deadlock. Council might say, here's a policy we passed, now implement it. And Wilson could say, nope. Vice versa, Wilson could put in administrative rules or sign a contract that the council disagrees with, and they protest it and try to pass policy to undo it. But Wilson is coming in promising collaboration and partnership with the new city council, and most councilors are saying the same thing. Of course, that could change really quickly. We know Wilson has a very specific agenda. He wants to advance in City Hall, ending unsheltered homelessness. And if council disagrees with his plan, things could get spicy. So we shall see. Get out the popcorn.
Okay, Dirk, the state has a new chief economist.
Yes.
The last person in this role presided over a series of very high kicker rebates. Now this new guy has come in and he is predicting an even bigger kicker? What is happening?
This is complex. We heard this week for the first time from the new state economist. His name is Carl Riccadonna. He'd spent a long time on Wall Street before coming to Oregon. And he was brought on in September after the former economist stepped down. Now, people who listen to the podcast likely know that this is a really important job. It issues revenue forecasts that lawmakers need and use to set the 2-year budget. And if those revenue forecasts underguess personal income taxes by 2% or more, we get a kicker refund. Taxpayers get a kicker refund. Mark McMullen, the former economist, presided over a series, as you said, of higher and higher kicker payments, culminating in this massive $5.6 billion refund earlier this year. And I think there is an expectation that Riccadonna will try to rein that trend in. In fact, he said specifically he was brought on with the understanding he needs to try to rein that trend in. He says he's going to do that by rejiggering some of the assumptions used to make revenue forecasts. But because of the timing of the kicker law, which I won't get into here, Lauren, he's really powerless to stop the kicker we likely have coming in 2026. In fact, Riccadonna's first forecast, which was yesterday, predicted the size of the kicker refund will be nearly double what was previously expected. So taxpayers, you may have $1.8 billion coming to you as of 2026.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's leave it there today. Dirk and Alex, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We're taking next week off, but we will be back in December with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.